Beneath the Jalisco sun, generations of the Martinez family have carved their lives into the soil, one agave at a time. Omar Martinez isn't a farmer chasing yield. He's a caretaker guarding the living ecosystem born from sweat, patience, and the pulse of the land. No chemicals, no shortcuts, just earth, rain, and time. When others saw crops, he saw a calling to heal sick agaves, to listen to what the soil whispers before it breaks. This isn't mass production. This is survival, discipline, and faith in the field itself. Welcome to the story of Omar Martinez, the man who farms with his hands, his heart, and his ancestors watching. On this episode of Tactical Tequila Podcast with your host, Matt Wilson.
If you enjoy the show, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it to your social media platforms. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show.
Welcome back, everyone. Matt with Tactical Tequila Podcast here. Tonight's show, we have Omar Martinez back on the show, but this time in a little different aspect. We're going to talk about agave and agave farming. In the heart of Jalisco, Omar Martinez walks through the field like a man in prayer, listening, not commanding. Every agave tells a story of struggle, drought, and rebirth. He doesn't fight the land, he works with it, healing each plant the way his father once taught him. No formulas, no machines, just dirt, devotion, and the heartbeat of generations beneath his boots. Omar, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
It's awesome to be back. Thank you for having me. And, I know last time we were here, we talked about doing this. I'm excited about this tonight's episode.
Yes, likewise. When you and I first chatted about this on the phone, about doing an episode just about agave, I was just blown away how you started to describe things and farming and just the things that you do in order to help the plants be sustainable through drought and things like that.
Yeah, so it's been a process. Like, when we started doing it, like when I started learning about it and, like really kind of running, the point on the fields, like there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to know, and it's not like it's not like any other crop where you prepare your land, you sow your seed, and then let it rain, and then you harvest in a few months. Like this is years, year after year after year of taking care of the same field. So it's a lot of work, but it's very rewarding as you see them finally growing, thinking that they would never get there. It's pretty cool.
So now going back to kind of like where it all began, what's the first memory that you have of being in an agave field, and how has that moment shaped the way that you farm the land today?
So I guess like the first memories are like, being a kid and growing up and, you know, I guess kind of growing up around it, you don't really think like you just kind of figure that's just life, this is what you were dealt. This is what, I guess it does you don't comprehend as a child, as a young kid that not everybody gets to see an agave field. Not everybody grows up around that stuff. It's not a view that everybody gets every day. So the one of the things I remember was when we were kids. Anytime we were prepping land, usually our cousins, all of us would be on the farm, on the weekends with our dads. One uncle would be prepping his field, and my dad would be prepping a field, or we would be with my uncles and my cousins. And when you first turn over the dirt, like you get a lot of little dirt rocks. We call them terrones. And, you can throw them at each other and they blow up like little powder. So we would have little dirt rock wars. And that was kind of like one of the first like memories I have, like core memory of being out in the fields, like prepping lands, was we would peg the hell out of each other with little dirt rocks. So that and like the evenings, whenever like the sun is hitting agaves, like whenever it's like golden hour, they make like a really different and specific color. And I guess more where we're from, because where the sun sets on our farm, like it'll go down right behind a mountain. So towards the end, it'll make rays and it'll be hitting agaves in different points. So you'll see like more light and more of that little lime green color they get at the very end of the day. So that's kind of like my first memories of an agave field.
I can imagine just exactly how beautiful that is to see those rays bouncing off the agaves. I mean, just sunset alone in an agave field is magical to me.
Yeah. There's it can play tricks on you too, though. So just recently, I was down there with my dad, and this year's been a crazy, crazy rain year. So there's been a lot more work in the fields than other years because of the amount of rain we've had this year. So where the sun rises in our farm, I guess you could imagine like our farm is kind of like situated like in a sort of valley. So when it rises, it's coming over a mountain from like, say, I'm looking at my agave field, the sun's rising behind me. So as it's rising over that mountain, right now with all this rain, like it's foggy in the mornings, it's the sun's coming through, starting to burn up that fog. So those first couple rays that hit with the fog will cast like different colors in the field. And whenever you have fungus affecting agaves, they'll turn like a paler color. So that initial like sunrise will have me looking out there like, we got a patch of bad agaves over here. Like, are they sick? So you start freaking out. And then as the sun gets higher, that color just disappears. So it'll play a trick on you a little bit.
Okay. Um, when did your family first start farming agave, and what traditions, as far as the farming goes, has been passed down to you in the way that you farm it today?
Well, my dad talks about how his dad and his grandfather, my grandfather's dad, um, back in the day, they would do what's called pionadas. So, way, way back then, and I think like uh, my dad remembers it well, but back in the day, like all the neighboring farmers, they would grow their crops. And then when it came time for harvests, all the neighbors would like help each other. So if it was, say, 30 farmers, all 30 farmers would be helping one farm. Then they would go to the next day to the next farm, next farm, next farm. And all those 30 wives would gather up and cook in every single farm to feed all the men. So those were called pionadas. So if you went 30 times, then all those 30 guys would come work for you for free and get your farm done. And I always asked my dad, I was like, so like what if one guy's farm was bigger than the other? And they're like, we just didn't care. Like that's how it was back in the day. And my grandpa would tell him the stories. And every night, so at night it would be like a drinking party. Everybody would drink tequila and stuff. And my grandfather always had parcels of agave because he would make his agave into tequila. And he had like pretty much how you would see moonshine jugs here, he had them in his farm little warehouse. So when my dad was getting older and started getting into like, young kids drinking, he would siphon some tequila out, fill it with water and like dilute it. So he always remembers my grandpa having like a bunch of glass jugs of tequila. And I think that was really cool, back in the day that that's how things were, you can't do that now. Everybody works in their own farm and, you don't really have that sense of um, family and community like you used to, the way they talk about it. Um, so that's kind of where we were always, had agave on our lands for that reason. Because my grandpa, especially my dad's dad, he was a big time farmer. Massive plots of land that he would farm, and sometimes he would rent other people's lands and just do a lot of different crops. But he always had his agave to be able to pay, everybody with tequila. So that's, kind of where, and that's how his dad did it. So that's how we were, brought into agave farming. And then we kind of like, when things weren't like the pionada times kind of ended, we always had tequila or agave on our farms. And we started like selling to other, bigger name brands, bigger distilleries. It was just something that was always part of our farm, along with corn and cattle. And it wasn't until I really like kind of took control that we made it a lot bigger. We started doing a lot more agave to where it's all agave. Because agave is something I saw that was a lot easier to maintain while also having a life here in the States. Some of the techniques that my grandfather and my grandfather used was always like trying to work with the land, not knocking down the trees, which was really heavily instilled with my dad. So like we don't clear cut our farms just to have more space for agave. We try to work around it. And we're really try to be light on chemicals. Like we don't want to pollute our lands and pollute our water sources. And some of the traditions, like, that have been passed on, and I remember when I was younger, I didn't really understand them, but working the dirt with the phases of the moon. So there's certain times where nobody will touch their dirt, and that's just something that was, like, passed down to where it's like religion to you. If there's a full moon or a new moon, like, you don't turn any dirt. You don't touch it.
Why is that?
So, some they would say that in like I've never wanted to do it because I'm scared of having that bad juju, but they say that dirts would get infested with disease, with plague, like and I think it has to do with acidity, you know. But back then, they would say like, oh, it'll plague up your dirt where your crops won't yield correctly. But I've done research into it now because, you know, we're 2025, so I wanna know the answers, and it does have to do with acidity, and it does have to do with, like, the light hitting the freshly turned soil. It does affect, pH component factors with the dirt.
Just to kind of take a step backwards, what do you think has changed between then and now as to why you don't see as much of the other outlying farmers helping out?
I think a lot of it has done had to do with, like, you know, let's just say my dad's generation, you know, he's yeah, you consider him, I think more or less the product of a baby boomer, but, you know, right in around in that generation. So, you know, back then families had like the head of households and farms had big families, a lot of kids. So they had a lot of hands to help, you know, work the farm. My dad's one of 9, my mom's one of 14. So like they're big families. So it wasn't hard to run these big farms and make it happen. But I think as these generations grew up, they wanted to go explore and live that other life of getting a career and like seeing what the big cities like. So a lot of people left these farms in that generation. And I think, you know, in pursuit of money of a different life. But I think that kind of has, like, you've seen a lot of, you know, I've seen in our areas, like farms that were just, you know, not your huge estates from like old money, you know, where it was just already a big farm in the early 1900s, but just your average farms. I think a lot of people went and searched for a better life. So it left farmers with less hands, less people to be able to work them. And I think that's kind of where you know, that you saw the decline of, like, all these available hands on the farms to help one another to continue to go.
Since you've stepped into your role as, leading the family's legacy with farming and maintaining, your family's farm, how has your perspective on agave changed? Are you more of a guardian or would you say an innovator when it comes to agave farming?
I'd like to say a little bit of both, um, because you can't really like, you can try to innovate agave farming as much as you want, but at the end of the day, like, the truth is gonna speak in the liquid. So if you rush agaves to grow, you're gonna have this big piña with a lot of mass, but the sugar's just not gonna be there. Um, and I don't think the flavor's gonna be there. And then one of the things that I feel like I'm very guardian like with the old ways is taking care of our land. So when I'm at our farm and being able to walk around the land and, you know, drink a coffee in the morning or have a tequila in the evening and just walk the land, there's spots on our land where my dad will tell me like, "Hey, under this tree, like I did this deal with such and such where I bought this land," or, you know, he'll tell me one of the farms we own, him and my grandfather used to cut firewood there, and like he didn't own that land at that point. He was just a young kid. So like when I walk those properties, I will like think about what it must have been like, you know, 30, 40 years ago before I was even here, what that land was like when my dad was able to walk it and, you know, be harvesting firewood here. But now with the modern times, I do rely on like the tractors, the modern tractors versus, you know, the way they used to plow fields back then. Um, I try to be as efficient as possible to get our plots ready, but doing it in the most respectful way to our land without trying to clear cut and just make it all about dollars and cents.
For those that are listening, run Run them through what a typical day of agave farming would look like.
Well, it depends on the time of year. So, for instance, right now, we're coming out of our rain season. And this year was an extraordinary rain season. I mean, a lot of water. We haven't seen a year like this in quite a while. So, for instance, a typical day like this, you're going to be weed eating a lot. And it depends too what kind of farmer you are. If you're going to rely on heavy chemicals, you're going to be doing a lot of spraying. You're going to be contaminating if that's what you're doing. If you're gonna try to keep your land, as chemical free as possible, you're gonna be weed eating a ton, taking care of all the weeds that are growing in the agaves right now to make sure you're not uh, denying your agaves of that sunlight. So, the early 1, 2, 3, and even 4-year-old agaves, they're battling weeds right now. There's so much water in the ground. We've probably been about 2 weeks with no rain right now, so it's near the end. We're done with the rain season. Like I said, this year was pretty extraordinary. So to answer your question, a day on this time of year, you're weed eating a ton. You're fertilizing. This is the time of year where you're fertilizing. You're giving that extra nutrient if your agave needs it, and you're checking your last rows to make sure that you don't have any type of corrective deficiencies you need to work on, or you don't have any pests in your agave. Because with all this rain, it's just a breeding ground for fungus to affect your agave right now.
So now, when it comes to the moisture and fungus, how do you mitigate having so much fungus and, for instance, maybe even like more of like a root rot?
So a lot of farmers will plow their field and they'll prep their agave field and it'll be flat. And obviously you got to think about, okay, like the way we prep our land, and this is something I learned from my dad. You got to prepare like the Noah's Ark is coming. You got to figure out where that water is going to go the day it does get there. So he always kind of runs, we kind of look at the layout of the land depending on what field we're on. Some will have more slope than others. The ones that have more slope, then it's just a guaranteed given. Like you don't really have to think about it that hard. But when you have a relatively flat piece of land, you have to consider, are you going to put your agave on raised rows? If you do that, the work the following years is a little harder because you have a raised row where the agave is on the high point. If you have a sloped piece of land, you don't necessarily have to raise the row. So that's one thing to consider. All those rows are going to dump out somewhere. So you have to figure out where you're going to make a drainage ditch to collect or, deviate that water. And the other thing is you want to make sure that you're not going to cause erosion and your dirt's going to end up in the neighbor's pasture. Like you want to keep your dirt on your land. So those are a few things to consider. We've had a lot of luck with raised rows, because it'll in the like midst of the rain season, agaves get the water they need. They're not a water heavy needing plant anyway. And with them being on the raised row, it kind of has helped us keep that excessive moisture off of those roots.
What would you say the biggest lesson the agave itself has ever taught you?
Mm, that's a good one because I've been burned a couple times on a couple fields. The biggest lesson is, well, my dad always said this, and it like kind of really hit me one year in an agave field. Um, the lazy person works twice as hard. So when you try to do things like quickly and oh, this will be fine, you kind of realize like it's not always the best result. Take a little more time in the beginning, and your outcome is going to be a lot better. So there was one year where we fertilized some agave, and the way you really want to fertilize it, depending on what you're applying, what deficiencies you have. You want to apply, if it's a granulated fertilizer, you want to apply it at the base of the plant. And there was one year where, they swore up and down that you could just dump it on the plant and it burned several plants. And then the bad thing is we didn't get enough rain that year. So it's a slow release fertilizer and it just did damage to some of my plants. And, um, it was a quicker way to do it, but it definitely didn't help. So, um, that I guess that's one of the lessons it's taught me is, really uh, take your time in the beginning, do things right, and your outcome's always going to be the right one.
Now, in an instance like that, how do you compensate and rebound for those plants that are harmed?
So we have a little mini tractor and it fits in between the rows of the agave. You can do like the mini plow, you can do a mulcher on it, whatever PTO driven machine you want, but it has a sprayer. So instead of going through the rows and like backpack spraying anytime you need to spray something, you can fill it with water. So we had to water this agave field for like 3 weeks, like twice a week. We were running water through it to get a little more moisture and break down that slow release fertilizer. So it ended up in the long run costing me more labor, more diesel, more time for that one instance. But that's the way we've remediated things in the past is adding more water.
I know usually it's an average of between 6 to 8 years when an agave matures. But how do you, as an agave farmer, how do you decide when the agave is truly ready to harvest? And beyond the numbers, what's the instinctual sign that you look for?
So there's a few things. The colors start to change a little bit on the plant. As they get older, they start getting a more of a lime green versus that like dark blue gray look. They start getting a more of a lime green look. The way the leaves spread out, you can start seeing differences as to the leaves on the bottom. There won't be that many like thick leaves covering the piña. They start to kind of die out, and you'll see more exposed piña. The thickness of the leaves to the base, you'll start seeing those big gaps of that make the piña look like what it looks like once it's harvested. So color is a big one. Obviously, if it's sprouted a quiote or not yet. So when I've had agave sprout quiotes before their fifth year, and when that quiote sprouts, the stalk, that thing can get up to 20 feet tall. If you let it grow, you're letting all that agave energy, the inulin at that point, use it's going all to grow the stalk to make the plant flower. Because an agave, if you let it flower, it'll flower once and then it dies. So you cut the quiote off and the plant will continue to grow and mature. So quiote is probably a number one sign, that'll obviously tell you like it's ended its life cycle, the color. But then also the other thing that prepares you and starts giving you the first sign that it's getting there is when an agave plant is like growing. It's all the spiky plants, the leaves, the very top leaf. Um, we call it el cogollo. That's where they all come from, and it'll open and open and open. The cogollo is always like the tallest point of the plant because that's where all the new leaves are coming from. When agave is getting mature, the cogollo starts getting shorter, and the leaves are all longer, and the cogollo starts getting a little bit shorter. And when you start seeing that little dip, is when you know like it's right there. It's gonna sprout a quiote in like the next few months.
What would you say people's biggest misconception of how difficult it is to cultivate agave to scale?
Mm, that's tough. As popular as tequila is, when I tell people the amount of years it takes for one plant to mature, a lot of people are like, "Oh my god, like how do you do it? I don't believe it." I think the years it takes for one agave plant to reach maturity, that's probably like the biggest wow factor I've seen in a lot of people that don't know anything about agave. And when you're talking about, 1 hectare, some people do up to 4,000 plants per hectare if there's no trees, nothing like that blocking your rows to plant. I think on average ours are about like 35 to 3,800 plants per hectare. So when you think about those 5 to 8 years to mature your agave, and you think about every dry season that you got to prepare to remove your pups, your hijuelos. So like the amount of work that takes. Then you have your rain season. If you have deficiencies, if you're going to apply nutrients, you have that window to do it, which is usually like end of May, beginning of June till about beginning of September. That's the only window you have. And if you have, fields of every year, so you have, let's say, your 6, 7 fields, and there's more work involved with the bigger plants because you're removing hijuelos because at that point you don't want to slow we call them madres, which is a mother plant. We don't want to slow the growth down of the mother. So you have guys with coas or barras, but we call them coas. It's not the actual coa, the jimar, the big round one, but it's like a flat blade. That's what we remove our hijuelos. So we're removing hijuelos, and then from there, you gotta mulch them or cut the root balls so they don't grow again. We leave all that in the rows of the agave to make a little bit of like mulch and ground cover to stop weeds. So there's just an immense amount of work really concentrated into like 2 times a year. So you really have to gear up and try to get all your work done for every single year in every field. And the problem is trying to find help and labor during that time. Everybody who does this is like being trying to be hired from this farmer and that farmer because everybody's doing it at the exact same time. So it's tough. It's a lot of work.
Now, do you find that it's hard to find that help during the times that you need this, or is it something that the workers sort of just kind of balance and to, go from job to job?
Um In my area, it is hard, but it's not. So there's like good amount of like crews that do this, and they'll bounce from farm to farms of people that have agave. But it requires like you have to like pay them good. And obviously, you have to pay them a good day's wage. You have to provide them with the meals every day. They'll probably ask you for gas money. These are the ones that the people that we hire to help us during the seasonal like influx of work, but we also have the people that are with us like all the time. So I've got two cousins, three guys that live in like neighboring farms, and then my uncle and his son. And then my dad and me will be down there too. So with us, we can do quite a bit. But when you're talking about a field of 80,000 plants and you got to remove hijuelos on all of these, you definitely need a lot more hands.
I can imagine with that many plants for sure. How do you balance the art and science of soil management for a healthy agave growth?
Well, that's it's a good question. So before we plant agave on a new piece of property or one that's been resting and now we're gonna plant agave, in the highlands we have typically a little bit more acidic soil. It's a little bit more iron rich. We have more red clay where we are compared to like the valleys. So they have more of a alkalinic type soil. So agave generally doesn't mind slightly acidic soil, but one of the main things is testing it. If we're too high, then obviously we got to add lime, bring it down a little bit. One of the other things too that is hard for us with acidic soil is that fungus likes acidic soil. So we have to make sure that we don't let our soil stay too low on the pH because it'll allow fungus to take over agave. So like mancha gris, which it translates to like the gray stain, and there's one called fusario. Um, those types of funguses are really hard to control because once you like really see signs, like let's say, like I said, 80,000 plants, you're gonna walk every maybe 5 to 10 rows and see as much as you can see. But if you kind of slip up and don't catch some signs of like fusario on your plants, that'll spread pretty quickly to other plants. And by the time you try to control it, it does stunt the agave quite a bit. Like it's hard to control that. So it's very important to be measuring, how acidic the soil is. That's one of the main things. So our best friend in that case is lime. We do a lot of agricultural lime to make sure our soil stays in the pH it needs to be.
What would you say the most critical environmental conditions that you watch on a daily basis are? And how do you keep the agave thriving for those conditions that you're watching out for?
Mm, I mean, there's several conditions like you have to be really considerate about. So like one as simple as like the border of your whole field. So in the rain season, if you allow too much grass to grow on the outer border, you're gonna have when it comes to dry season, you're gonna have just a huge border of just dry grass. So like God forbid a wildfire. That's gonna bring it straight into your field. And agave will not tolerate fire, it'll kill it. So that's one of the things. The other thing is in the rows, there's weed. You got to have weed control. Weed control is a huge thing because certain weeds will, choke out the agaves, won't let them grow right. So that's one of them. The other thing is with weed growth, if you don't have a properly manicured agave field, you can't see some of the signs of infestation. So there's, beetles and worms and stuff like big, like larva type grub looking worms that'll burr holes in the base of the agave and they'll eat the agave out. The agave is pretty hardy. It can be taking a lot of damage, but not show signs on the outside. So if you're not like constantly looking and finding these holes, because when we see burr holes on the base of our agave, we'll dig it out. We'll clean those agave leaves out so we can get in there and like dig and see what's in there. A lot of the times we'll find like those beetles and stuff that's been eating and burrowing our agave. So I think that's really important is the cleanliness of the field to be able to prevent these. Because by the time an agave shows signs of like an animal eating it, there's pretty much nothing left inside.
Now, you've mentioned a couple times in the show about weed eating and making sure that the rows are clean. Do you do it with machinery, or is it something that you release like goats or horses or even cows, out to eat the grass?
You can do goats and horses, you cannot do cows. Cows will eat agaves. Like they don't care, they'll bite it. So we have let loose like retired. So in Mexico, we do charreria, and you use a lot of horses in that event for lassoing and stuff like that. You don't really see that here in the States. The only like wild horses you'll see is like the ones they buck. Um, Over there, you'll have a lot more influx of like horses that people just have for these events. So a lot of the times, if you have like a really overgrown agave field, you can reach out. I have friends that they participate in professional charro teams. So I'll ask them like, hey, do you have any horses you want to let graze? And we'll send them up to a farm and let them eat. So that's one good way. Goats are a good way as well, but you got to make sure you reinforce all of your wire because coyotes will eat people's goats. So a lot of times people won't really say, "Yeah, take my goats," because they might not be there the next day. Um, and then the other thing we do is like if we have a field like this year, we gave away a lot of free grass as we were cutting. Especially around the outer areas, we'll take those big machetes and like cut the grass as low as we can, and we'll let people either they'll come cut it and we'll give them the grass, or they can come tie a horse up on the edges and we'll keep moving the horse to eat all the grass on the outer edges. um, so it's kind of a mix of, livestock feeding to keep the grass clean and weed eating, like machine weed eaters just going through rows by rows.
We talked a little bit about soil composition throughout the show, but how do altitude and soil composition change the flavor in the DNA of the agave?
So in the lower altitudes, like the valleys, I think tequila is like 3,400 feet above sea level, and we're like 58 to 6,000 feet above sea level. So it gets a lot colder on the highlands. So again, agave doesn't really like cold. So that's part of the applications of nutrients and fertilizers we do at the end of the rain season because this is when it starts to get cold. So agave doesn't really like the cold that much. So lowland agaves seem to mature a little bit quicker than highlands do because of the cold stress that the plants receive. It takes them longer to mature fully. And I think, like me personally, I've seen and I've tasted, and to me, all the like a lot of the lowland agaves just seem pepperier than the highlands. The highland just always seems like, I know it's not the right word, but this is the word I like to use. It's like more like musty, more fermented. And the my best example is like Siete Leguas. Like I love that tequila. I like the way it tastes. And that's kind of the smell, the nose, the taste I get from a Highland agave. And a lot of, I've heard a lot of industries, a lot of distilleries, a lot of farmers will say that we get more sugar on Highland agaves because it takes them longer. I think part of that is every time they get into the warm season from going through that cold spell, they come back with like more vigor. Is like, okay, it's warm again. I think, and we will see. Like I've noticed it on my farm. we'll see that instant green of the center of the plant sprouting all the new leaves when we start getting into those warmer temperatures. So I think the my biggest thing is I think the temperature has to do a lot with it. I think that cold puts it into that dormant state to where when it wakes up every year, it has a lot of like energy ready to thrive.
So you would definitely say that agave in the highlands more or less hibernates in the
That's
wintertime?
That's kind of how, like, I feel, this is just my opinion, but that's kinda how I feel like it is because I see it in other plants, I'll see it where when the springtime comes, like, you just see a lot more vigor in all the landscape, uh, and when I've it could be, the richer soil because a lot of the soils in the lowlands is very rocky, and like, I know it's good for agave, like, it doesn't need a very nutrient dense soil, but I feel like that has a lot to do with it as well. You know, it just doesn't seem as, like, fertile to me.
So now, very loaded question for you.
Okay.
Outside of your own brand, what's your favorite tequila?
Uh, well, before we went on, we talked about it a little bit. Um, Cascawin, I'd like Cascawin, but partly Siete Leguas because of memories. I remember when that brand was first making, like, its noise in the industry. It was a very popular brand in our region, and I guess most of Mexico, and I was still pretty young. But, that's one of the tequilas that, like, as a teenager when I started drinking, um, the taste is kind of what, like, has, like, a little bit of memory to me when I drink it. It reminds me of these older times when, we were drinking with family and cousins and friends. And now that, I'm in the industry, we're in the highlands, I kinda see, like, the differences as what a highland tequila kind of starts to resemble what a lowland tequila starts to resemble.
Now, see, for me, you said you get this kind of like musty type flavor on Highlands. I get so much of a minerality flavor on a Highlands agave tequila. And honestly, I don't know whether or not I prefer Highland over Lowland. I think good quality tequila anyway is good when I'm drinking. I don't really have that preference per se. And just as we had talked a little bit before the show, I have my favorite, which for me, I love a malolactic tequila. Siempre Vivo is probably my favorite all time. And then after that, it was, more of like Fuente Seca, which is kind of different. It's not that malolactic flavor, but those would be my two top tequilas that I really like. And I think it's just the flavors within both of those that does it for me.
Yeah, and, like, most of the times, I really love experimenting with blancos just because that's where you're really gonna I feel like that's the closest I'm gonna get to their land, to their agaves. Once you've put it in a barrel, you kinda change everything, and now you have to appreciate the barrel. But
Yeah.
I love tasting different, blanco tequilas because that's where I can kind of, like, get that feeling that I'm looking for of, like, how connected was it to the land. And obviously the water you use and the way you cook it and the way your different methods of distillation, that's going to change everything. But for me, the blancos is usually what I like to go for because it just instantly brings me to the farm. That's kind of how I feel when I drink different blancos.
I've said this on several shows, but for me, I'm a high proof or still strength. That's my jam. And I've always said that when a producer puts those out, you're getting what they are trying to basically put out, the flavor of their agave. Like that's what they want you to experience the most is the agave flavor after it's been cooked. And as you said, then you start sticking it in barrels and then of course you get the barrel notes and everything on top of that, but you want to do a Blanco or a high proof, you will get the true expression of what that agave or tequila producer is trying to put out there in their flavor profile.
Yeah, and that's something I've really liked about, the past few years where fuertes and high proofs, everything has been a lot more popular. People are looking for that more. We have a special project that we're doing with Pedro Furtivo for that especially, and to honor a really special piece of land that I have. That those agaves are. I don't think I'm gonna harvest them yet this coming year, but it's debatable. Like they're very ready, but I think that can squeeze one more year out of them.
And you alluded to that on the last episode, and I am very excited to see where you guys go with that and to taste a high proof from you guys.
We're excited. I've been like really beating Peter up about this because I know he knows his stuff. Like there's so much I learn every time we're at the distillery and we're talking, he's explaining to me how we could let's tweak this and it's gonna do this, this, and this. So I'm always very excited. But for like this piece of land, I'm like, listen, Peter, this is like going on 7 to 8 years of my life. And if this product isn't perfect, like I'm gonna be really upset. So I'm very like critical about how we're gonna do it, but I'm very excited. Like it's very exciting to me. I think it's gonna be a way to honor my family and the like you said, the different people that have been, the different heartbeats that have been on that soil that now I'm working. It's gonna be a really cool way to honor, my past generations and my dad.
Now, in talking about honoring those past generations, how do you educate the future and how do you educate the workers, the next generation of humidors on the sustainable practices of agave farming?
So one of the main things that I really like try to implement and tell people about that'll listen to me is the chemicals used. Like I try not to use any type of harsh chemicals on weed control. Everything we apply nutrient wise is kind of on a needed basis. um I'm very big on like not trying to add unnecessary chemicals into the ground because we have ponds on our farms where when it rains, kind of the little bit I was talking about when you drain a field, we route all that rainwater into our ponds and we have it stocked with fish. So like I don't want to be, you know, ensuring our agave is healthy and weed free and then killing all the fish because until like kind of just keeps dragging on the life cycle, like eventually it's going to get to us. So I'm kind of big on um the try to be as clean on the chemicals as possible. That's one thing. And then I really am trying hard to use agave waste as much as I can. Because right now at distilleries, like they'll pretty much pay you to pick up, agave fibers because they pile up like crazy. And you don't really see mulch use in Mexico like you do here, like pine straw beds and mulch beds. So like we spread that on the field. The only thing is you got to be careful because it can be a breeding ground for fungus. So you got to know where to apply it and where to keep it away from the plants. So those are the kind of like the few things because I don't have kids yet. My older siblings do, and I see those kids like my kids. And the one thing I think about is like, okay, once we're gone, like, what are we leaving for them?
Now, if you could change one outdated farming practice across Mexico's agave industry, what would it be?
Mm, with agave in general or farming in
Yeah,
general?
no, well, let's do both agave and agave farming.
Mm, with agave farming, the government's kind of put a stop to it, but in the early years, like people were clearing land like crazy left and right just to fit as much agave as they could. So, like, I'm pretty against like knocking unnecessary trees down because the like here in Georgia, like we have a ton of trees. We don't have it like that in Mexico. So I think trees are very important, and that's a big one for me. Like the deforestation, I think we should try to use the plots that are available and try to work around the trees as much as possible. And with farming in general, I think it's the harsh chemicals. That's a really big one for me. Like I don't like seeing these people spray, these harsh uh systemic weed control because that's just something that's getting into the soil and then whether you like it or not, you're absorbing some of these heavy metals into your crops.
How would you say for those that do use these harsh chemicals in order to weed control and, fungus control or anything like that? How would you say that that would change the flavor of the agave and also the flavor of the tequila?
with the harsher chemicals.
Yes.
So it wouldn't necessarily change the flavors to a notable amount, maybe to the human palate. But if you do deeper analytics, like in the plant tissue, you can find traces of heavy metal, which in turn is a carcinogen, for the human body. So that's kind of like one of the things where you're either going to be more organic or you're just going to be the boxed food in the Walmart aisle. Those are one of the things because there's a lot of organic based herbicides because I think that's one of the heaviest chemicals is herbicides in agave farming. Trying to keep these lands clean, people will use the harsh chemicals like the roundups and stuff, and it'll really soak into the dirt.
When you think about the future of agave farming, how do you see technology being used in farming? Would you say that drones or even sensors or AI, how do you see that as impacting the next wave of agave farming?
So I've used the drones. They're interesting. I worry about the waste because there's just so much micro droplet being sprayed everywhere. So sometimes I worry that it's a little inefficient and I worry that it's not enough coverage. But I've tried the drones before and I wasn't as impressed for one, the price of the drone, um, the amount of charge time you have to have a running generator the whole time to charge the drone while you're applying. And then the other thing is if you have like trees nearby, it's really hard. Like I like driving the drones. I drive drones here in Atlanta. So when my ag engineer brought his drone, I said, bring it over, let's try it. I was like, let me drive it. And he was like, if you wreck it, you bought it. And this thing's like 30 grand. I was like, yeah, let me drive it. And he's like, here, let me show you how to map the plot and, map the piece of land. And I was like, no, I'm just going to freestyle it. So I was driving this thing and he was so worried and it'll give you a ding. You got about like 10 to 15 minutes of runtime depending on how heavy your hopper is. So you got to be coming back to where you're at and then you have like this like you know bullet case looking battery that you are charging on a generator and then you swap it and go again. um it's innovative and it's cool and there's a ton of people using them. I have a cousin that has a business of this and he does corn and all kinds of crops, but I'm pretty um I'm pretty reliant on the tractor sprayers, especially the little tractor because it'll fit anywhere. I like using that technique more than the drones. Um, One of the things I've been doing a little research on is like when people copper bond their plants. So that's kind of something I want to practice with is seeing the electromagnetic fields on these lands to see if that changes anything. Because there's been research on like stuff here in the states where they'll run copper bonding wires and it kind of changes electrical fields around the plants. So I've got a few things I want to experiment with to see if it does any for better or worse. One of the other things I've seen are drip irrigation for agaves where they're being fed nutrients. And I've read that they mature faster but they're lower in bricks content. So I don't know if it's counterproductive. I mean, I think in all reality, the time is just something you can't fake with agave. Like you can't rush them. They have to take the time they're going to take.
So patience is key for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, kind of shifting away from technology, what would you say one old school way of or method that your family uses do you think that science can't replicate?
Mm, hmm. I mean, there's a lot of things like, on the farm in general that are just like traditions. But with agave, I think it's like the use of organic fertilizers, the cow manure, the chicken manure, the the time to let plants grow, um, and just the way we cultivate the land. I just think there's not really a way where you can throw AI at it and you're going to make the process smoother or easier or make it take less labor. Um, I just think the working where you're turning physically the dirt over and, working the dirt manually, I just really, especially with agave, because there's not like a big machine that you can just drop the plow and it's going to clean it for you. I think that realistically, without any kind of chemical engineering, there's no real scientific way to upkeep an agave without physical labor.
Do you think it's more science or religion or maybe just a rebellion against nature for agave farming?
Mm, a little mix of both, I think, because realistically, I don't know. I think it's very interesting because, you know, when you think of farming, you think corn, you think soybean, you think, cotton, you think of all these things you'll see that you read about in books as a child. You don't think of agave. And when you see an agave field, it's just like this massive, like not even a color you really see in nature that often, like this blue gray. So it's very shocking to see, but to me, it's very interesting. Like, there's a lot of different ways I look at it. It's very interesting because one of the biggest carbon sequester plants is agave. I think it even does more than bamboo. I think it does like 60 tons per acre. So to me, I think it's so interesting that you talk about deforestation and warming, but this plant is taking in the most carbon dioxide than any other plant. So when you're looking at it from a perspective of carbon credits and stuff like that to offset the carbon footprint, I think it's kind of like a catch 22. You talk about people saying, "Oh, the earth is getting hotter because these people are doing all this agave and there's no more of these other crops," but nobody's talking about how much carbon is taking and putting back into the dirt. So it's a little bit of a mix of both.
So now you talked about this earlier in the show when you walk through the field at sunrise. You mentioned a little bit about how it could be deceiving, with the sunrise and everything. But when you walk through the field at sunrise, outside of those aspects that you're like, oh my gosh, like we have these plants that need attention, that deceiving factor. What would you say is running through your mind most? Is it gratitude, worry, or just pride?
Uh, Pride's probably the biggest one. And I don't really feel worried until I see things I should be worried about. One of the other things that I'm really always looking at is the hijuelo ratio per plant. So that's one of the things I'll look on for every year. So if I see one plant with, or one section of plants that has a ton of hijuelos, and I see like a whole separate section that doesn't have that many, very, very limited, I'll always be paying attention to what my boots feel like in the dirt, how hard that dirt is. And that kind of like, you know, will make me think of like how did we prep this year for this plot, like what did we do for this land, and it kind of keeps me on my toes about prep for every plot to come, because one of the a good friend of mine, he grows a lot of agave, and I actually bought hijuelos from him one time, and we were walking his farm, and he's like, you feel that, like you feel your shoes, and I'm like, what do you mean? So you feel how soft everything is, and I was like, yeah. He's like, that's how you need to have your fields at all times to make sure that these roots can grow and go sideways and down and everything. So I really take the dirt work into account, because for the first 2, maybe 3 years, you can still run your small tractor and kind of replow and loosen the dirt. But that first initial rip of the dirt is very important. And that's one thing I always try to see is like, as we're getting into year 5, year 6, and year 7, like how tight did that dirt get?
So now, what do you think outsiders miss the most when they romanticize the image of a humidor in the field?
Mm, I've been asked this one time, and the humidor is like the rock star of the story. He's like, you know, he's there just to deliver the baby. He didn't see, but usually what's funny is most humidores are the same guys who are doing the work the years before, unless they're strictly just a humidor crew. But the real work, when people see the jimador out there, making the ball after he's cut all the leaves off, the piña's ready, they're taking this idea of like what a hard working man, like, that the amount of work he's doing. But the real work is the years that it took to get there, I think. And the hands that it took to take care of that agave up to that point. Not saying that himando a whole field is not hard, it's freaking ridiculously hard. But the amount of I think what people don't understand is like the 5 to 7 to 8 years it took to get to that point. That's one thing that I think gets overlooked a lot. Because when you plant a field, like freshly planted, like we just planted it yesterday, they look like onions, like they're tiny. And the common term in Mexico for when you're planting is like either like a lime size or a grapefruit size or a pineapple size. We're talking about the piña we're about to plant. And, if you do a whole field of, like grapefruit size agave pups, you plant them and you walk away and you look at them and you're like, I'm never gonna see these mature because they're so small. And to think like this little 1 foot stem of a hijuelo pup will grow into like a 6 foot tall and like, you won't even be able to like wrap your arms around it. It's pretty amazing. I have fields that I have pictures of where we had just planted them to like them now at maturity. And it's wild how much the view changes.
Now, with production goals, how do you balance those goals and the emotional bond that you have with the plants?
Mm, I think it's difficult for us as a brand because we're new. So, we're people are discovering us like every day, every event we do, like Arte Agave, people come up to us and I've never seen this. And can I get it in this state? Get I get it in that state? So we're at a tough point because I think, now, like, yeah, production, I'll be able to handle it like, I feel like forever. But then as we get into more and more states and like more and more sales and people know more of our product and we make better, more and more business relationships where we're on somebody's menu, the production is going to grow and grow. And I think what really helps is like seeing those numbers and how we're projecting. Because when we decided to do this brand, and me and Peter kind of teamed up, and again, like we had been talking and like kind of staging this for a few years before we actually launched our brand. I do have plots kind of allocated from smaller to bigger for this specifically. So as the brand grows, we have plots that are bigger and bigger and bigger to be able to handle that influx. And I think, having that, perceived or maybe real scarcity, if we were to run out, I think will kind of like make the brand, it'll make people kind of like, oh, okay, I'll wait on that brand when I see it again. Because there's some brands that are doing that now. Like you can't go just anywhere and find a Fortaleza. So I think we want to make a sizable amount. We want to grow and be a good brand, but we don't want to just be like, you can find me anywhere, If we run out, then we run out. It's next year there'll be more.
So, no outsourcing of agaves in that instance, then.
My plan for now is no. But if we were to grow more and more, my plan would be to try to buy more land or rent more land, lease land, and continue to plant more because it's a huge undertaking. But again, we're a new brand, so like we're in it to be a good quality product. We're obviously in it to make money as well. So as we see more money, then I will try to allocate more land if I see that that's the way we're going. Right now, we do count with a good bit of land, so I'm not that scared that we won't be able to keep up with production. But I do want, because this is a 6 year agave plant, 6, 7, 8 years. By the time I do realize, like, oh no, we don't have enough, it's gonna be too late. So I do have some really good friends that have farms that they've agreed to lease to me if it came to that point. And we're kind of trying to see, like, we're always looking at our projections of what we're selling to kind of plan ahead and be ahead of that curve. So I want to say no, that there won't be any outsourcing, but if overnight we became a tequila sensation, then I have to really see what would happen. And even if we were to outsource, I think I would be the one in charge of the work schedule, the any type of nutrient application schedule, and a maintenance schedule. I would want to oversee all of that for any agaves we were to take on.
Now, in talking about your farm and everything, give the viewers and listeners an idea of how big your agave farm is.
So we're roughly right under like 250 acres. So it's, it to me it's huge, but obviously there's bigger farms out there. Um, and 1 acre is about 2.4 hectares. One of the bigger farms, it has a lot of trees, so there's certain areas we can't really put agave on, and we're very respectful of the trees, so we're not going to take them down. But as of right now, I still have a few sections available for new next year's plots and following. And we are going bigger as we get into every year. We're making them just a little bit bigger, but we're kind of calculating everything based off like what a successful brand does yearly in bottles and liters. And that's kind of what we're basing our plantations off of to make sure we're not overdoing it, but we're not underdoing it. But one of the things to take in consideration is like, okay, let's say we harvest a piece of land this year and we're going to make this much Blanco. We're going to pull out this much Repo that's been sitting in barrels. Now we got to replenish that Repo with making new Repo that's going to sit for 6 months. And then same thing with añejos, like how much añejos in the barrels are we going to replenish that for, the next and the next year? Because, depending on what we do with our next añejo, the one we currently have is 31 months. So it's a lot of, like, planning that goes into it and thinking of, like, how to keep everything stocked.
What legacy do you want your agaves, your land, to leave behind 100 years from now?
That's pretty good. So I'd like for, me as Omar, legacy to be like, even though I was born in Mexico, born in Salacan del Rio. At a young age, I came to the States because my dad was following his American dream. And, and that was like what a lot of people in his generation were doing. Everybody was coming to the States for new opportunities. And that's where a lot of farms and family land just got left behind. And people just kind of, it wasn't like when I hear my dad talk about when he was a kid and how people would farm and everywhere you went was just farming. Um, I was fortunate enough to go on a trip with a mentor of mine to Brazil and like seeing the way they farm over there, it's unreal. And it made me think of my dad's stories of what like it looked like for him growing up. So I would like for like my legacy to be like, even though I was taken away from being able to like be on the path to live that life of like being a Mexican farmer, like something inside me, whether I could have easily just continued my degree of software engineering and never worried about a farm in my life, but the decisions I made not consciously took me back to Mexico to revamp these farms that were my heritage to begin with. And I would like for to be able to have something like no matter um where you are in life or what you do, like your heritage, like your true history and your bloodline, like that calls you back to where you need to be. And I think that's kind of how I'd like to be remembered, where I could have done it a million other ways, but I came right back to where my family's always been.
Now, let's say you're 6 feet under. One sentence that sums up your legacy.
mm, Man, that's a good one. One sentence. um I just have so many things running through my mind, but um I guess no matter how hard you try, your true heritage and your true sense of belonging will always call for you. So it'll find you no matter where you're at, and it'll always bring you back.
I love that, Omar. Thank you so much. Where can everyone find you on social media?
So everybody can find me at Omar Martinez 01 on Instagram, and also at Pedro Furtivo Tequila on Instagram. You'll be able to see some of the farms, some of the stuff we do on the farm. Be able to see everything. Check out what we're doing.
Well, I appreciate your time, Omar. Thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Have a good night.
Thank you for having me. Have a good night. Thank you.